Hello, everyone, and welcome to the American Society of International Law, Human Rights and Latin America Interest Groups hosted webinar on climate justice and human rights at the core of climate action. I'm honored to welcome our panelists and all the participants who are joining us today to a conversation on one of the most urgent and critical issues of our time. As we all realize, as the impacts of climate change intensify, affecting every corner of our planet, we are reminded that this is not just an environmental issue, but also a human issue. And we also realize that climate change disproportionately affects those who have contributed the least to its causes. And we are talking here about marginalized communities, indigenous peoples, and vulnerable populations, especially in the global south. Our focus today is on climate justice, which is a concept that goes beyond reducing carbon emissions. It calls for placing human rights, fairness, and equity at the center of our climate policies and actions. True climate action must involve addressing the systemic inequalities that exacerbate climate impacts and ensuring that those most affected are at the forefront of decision-making processes. Today, we have an incredible panel of experts who will explore this important topic. I want to appreciate and thank them for joining us in this conversation. Professor Lisa Mogera will be joining us shortly. He is Professor of Global Environmental Law at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in the United Kingdom, and also an adjunct professor in International and European Union Environmental Law at the University of Eastern Finland. She has advised governments and civil society in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the South Pacific. Professor Mogera is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on climate change. Professor Damilola Olawiye SAN is the UNESCO Chairholder on Environmental and Sustainable Development at the College of Law, HBKU, Qatar. He is the Global Vice Chair, International Law Association, the umbrella body, and the President and Chair of the Executive Council of the Nigerian branch of the International Law Association. He is also an independent expert and member of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Professor Angela van der Berg is the director of the Global Environmental Law Center and an associate professor of law at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Her research focuses on the intersections between climate change, environmental law, constitutional law, and public governance. She is widely published in matters of environmental conservation and natural resource use, public governance, urban planning, and climate change, and how these issues should inform law and policy approaches. Once again, thank you, our panel of experts. To our participants, attendees joining us, please use the Q&A function box on your screen to send in your questions, and they will be addressed as the webinar progresses or at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I will invite our panelists to address some critical issues on climate change, which we'll be considering today. And the first question which I have is considering talking broadly about the severity of climate impacts. In actual fact, Professor Mogera recently released a special report on promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, and there she identified some challenges with regards to climate change mitigation, adaptation, just transition, climate finance, loss and damage. So given the increasing severity of climate impacts, how can states ensure that climate policies effectively incorporate human rights principles to protect vulnerable communities, especially, as I mentioned in the opening statement, in regions which are most affected by climate change? And Demilola or Angela, anyone can jump in to answer the question.
Well, thank you very much, Oyeni, for setting the tone and, of course, for inviting me to be part of this important session. I want to thank the entire interest group for focusing on this issue, as well as your committee for forging a link between existing work on climate change, justice, as well as human rights. And it's my pleasure to also present our compliments on behalf of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. As you you know, we have been looking at this issue as part of our mandate to disseminate and promote the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And as you mentioned in your introduction, Dr. Oyeni, climate change is not just an environmental issue or an academic issue. It's indeed a human rights issue. And one can look at it from two perspectives. The direct impact of climate change on human rights, the failure to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gases that cause climate change will directly impact all human rights, including the right to life, the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the rights of indigenous peoples to livelihood, and even the right to education. So the direct impact of climate change are severe, and that's why studies have described and a lot of countries have identified climate change as an emergency, which has led to increased regulation and legislation in this regard. Of course, the second aspect is the indirect impact. That is how efforts, projects, and even policies aimed at addressing climate change may, on their own, then worsen human rights outcomes or lead to adverse human rights impact. And we've seen concerns about how emission reduction schemes, CDM projects, and the likes, maybe leading to even REDD+ projects, maybe leading to land grabs, violation of indigenous rights, exclusion of women and youth from decision-making processes, lack of transparency and accountability. That is the same problems in typical projects that led to climate change in the first place are now sort of reappearing in efforts to address them. And we've also seen concerns about greenwashing and human rights washing, in which businesses increasingly say release well-polished and well-designed reports saying how much they have done. Meanwhile, when you look at it, it's empty nonsense. And our working group has been particularly concerned about this issue of greenwashing and human rights washing. And you would have seen that we released a report last year titled Extractive Sector, Just Transition and Human Rights, which I presented to the UN General Assembly in the 78th session, talking about how this indirect impact of climate change efforts, how businesses need to do better in terms of ensuring that not only are they acting to reduce and mitigate their impact, but to also be more transparent in their efforts, especially in their sustainability reports and the likes. But of course, in preparing that report, we had wide-ranging consultations. So we heard from businesses themselves, and they would tell you, well, it's not that we don't want to address climate change, but what do we do when we are operating in a country whereby they still believe that climate change is a punishment from God and it's not scientific? We are complying with the law. We are a business. We are not, we're a business. Our purpose of existing is to make profit. And we're complying with all the laws. It's just that the state has not made any law and the state does not even believe in climate change. So what should we do? Of course, that would be one of the arguments we had in our consultations. And of course, we've also had arguments about, well, this idea of sustainability reports, there is even no requirement by the state in the first place for us to release the report. So we're only doing our best. Or this whole idea of ESG, in which there are different methodologies on ESG, and we don't even know which one to follow. And so we're only just doing our best. So to directly answer your question, I think states must do better to set clarity and to increase regulatory coherence and clarity that ties together these issues. Because for us, our mandate mainly is to look at what states and businesses could do to advance the UNGPs. But we see increasingly that the starting point is for states to set the rule of the game in a very clear, coherent manner. And that will include integrating strong human rights safeguards when designing climate policies. And what we see on the ground is that in many countries, when it comes to human rights safeguards, it's with the Ministry of Human Rights or Ministry of Justice, as some countries call it. And then when it comes to climate, it's with the Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Climate and Environment. And then there's really hardly that coherent design of policies. So I think, from my perspective, states must do better in terms of integrating strong human right language, human right due diligence into climate policies and legislation, as well as doing better in reducing regulatory inconsistencies, institutional fragmentation, overlaps, operating in silos, which do not reflect the fierce urgency of the climate change problem.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, that was so insightful in terms of strong human rights language, and especially in societies where we hear of corporate capture, especially over states. So Angela, before you come in, I just noticed Elisa has joined us. Thank you very much for joining us. And the question which I posed, and I made reference to your recently released report as well on climate change. So the question which I posed was, how can states ensure that climate policies effectively incorporate human rights principles to protect vulnerable communities, especially in regions most affected by climate change? So Angela will respond, and then you'll come in. Thank you. Angela.
Thank you, Oyeni. I also would like to thank the interest groups and the American Society of International Law for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to echo the last comments of Damilola on, states having to do more and states incorporating human rights-based language. I think on a very pragmatic level, something that states can do is to, beyond, recognizing a constitutional environmental right or some form of environmental right, even if it's in framework legislation, but linking that to other rights, like the right to life, health, food, water, and housing, and making sure that that is a foundational element of climate action in policy. And I think a pragmatic way to go about it could be states requiring national laws to mandate that all climate policies undergo human rights impact assessments to ensure that they don't disproportionately impact vulnerable communities. I think another practical thing states can do is that when they adopt adaptation or mitigation measures, they should see how these can address entrenched injustices. How it should also look at how these can address inequalities and discrimination within the country, particularly between vulnerable communities, and make sure that whatever adaptation and mitigation actions are underpinned in law and policy, that they don't result in unintended human rights violations. If we think about some mitigation measures, if we think about the just energy or green energy transition, there's quite a lot of research showing that just transitioning can also lead to unintended human rights violations. For instance, in some African countries, having children then work in the new green economy, but under less favorable conditions and things like that. I think another practical option can be, states really not continuing to subsidize activities or investments that are inconsistent with a transition to a lower carbon economy. On another practical level, we can look at participation. So making sure that participation processes factor in the rights of children and women, the elderly, differently abled, and making sure that there are innovative solutions to tailor to the needs of these people. So many times we see that Indigenous communities have have very valuable knowledge and practices for climate adaptation or managing resources, and those are often not incorporated into climate action or climate policy. So I think that is an opportunity for states to capitalize on. And then just as a final comment, I think that if we think about international cooperation and solidarity, states should really work together, not only within, their own continent or with their own regions, but across that. I'd like to see, the European Union, for example, working with the African Union, sharing good practices, building capacity, strengthening technical assistance. There is financial aid, yes, but maybe reducing the barriers to financial aid for developing countries. But I'll stop over there and give over to Elisa.
Thank you. Shall I just go straight in?
I think Oyeni was on mute.
Oh, sorry. I think I was muted. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to circle back to you on subsidizing investments because I know it's a big problem in some countries. But yeah, thank you very much for that insightful response. Sorry, Elisa, you may proceed.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for organizing this important debate, and sincere apologies for joining a bit late. I think in many ways I second what the first two speakers already said, and maybe what I'd like to offer based on the first two reports I've been working on, I'll put the links in the chat, is that unfortunately we now have a significant body of evidence and of lived experiences of the unequal negative impacts of climate change and of some climate change solutions. And I think states have an obligation to take the evidence very seriously and really, I think, raise the awareness of any public authority that can be in a position to prevent any further negative impacts of climate change and climate change measures, taking into account that strong foreseeability of where the impacts are being felt and by whom. And in fact, my first report very much focused on the need for an intersectional approach in preventing further negative impacts. And I think there may be a couple of key points that have emerged. One is the importance of understanding and addressing climate change in a holistic way in the context of the triple planetary crisis. Very often our efforts to address climate change are ineffective and lead to negative human rights impacts because we do not take into account the evidence and the negative impacts on biodiversity or potential impacts arising from toxics. That also means that we need much more cooperation across sectors, and that concerns research and public authorities at different levels, including internationally, thinking about the work, for instance, of the IPCC and other international bodies. The second aspect that I think has arisen as a critical blind spot in not being able to develop more effective and fair climate measures, thereby leading to a series of human rights violations, is, I think, the still limited attention to culture, cultural heritage, cultural dimensions, and of course, different knowledge systems, including indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. And again, that engagement with the lived experiences of those most affected by climate change, who are just not seen on the same level as, say, climate experts in understanding the problems and preventing, I think, foreseeable problems in the context of climate decision-making. And that's where I think two aspects are crucial. One is, I think, access to information around really the magnitude of actual and potential negative human rights arising from climate change and climate change response measures, and information about the adequacy of state responses and business responses to effectively prevent further negative human rights impacts. And that's where my second report that has just been released has focused on. But the other aspect, which I think has already been touched upon, is the importance of prior assessments. And I think that's where the holistic understanding and using the lens of the human right to a healthy environment can be really crucial, to think not only about environmental impact assessments and human rights, including cultural rights impact assessment of activities that either can contribute to climate change or that are meant to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And that includes the use of climate finance, which unfortunately, again, has also led to negative impacts on human rights. But I think earlier on, we need to engage much more strategic assessments of planned policies, programs, and legislation, so as to embed that practice within the public sector and across sectors to take duly into account the growing evidence of the negative impacts of human rights and of climate change and climate change measures, and on whom in particular those human rights violations are being affected. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate that. Now, that gives us a good segue to asking about your experiences as you reflect on some of these issues and discussions. So in your experience, what are the most significant challenges and opportunities in aligning the agendas of human rights and climate action at an international level? Elisa, you can give it a go if you.
Yes, thank you. So I think there's a main ideological challenge, which I think is the misperception that human rights requirements and standards are an additional requirement on states on top of the climate action they need to take, as opposed to seeing human rights as the way in which climate action can be more effective and fair. And so this idea of this being an additional burden on states, as opposed to looking at the benefits of joint gap thinking around multiple obligations. And I think if we think about the advisory opinion of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea on states' climate obligation, we see how that joint gap thinking actually supports states in identifying a path of more efficient action on the protection of the environment, on climate change, and in fact on human rights. But the ideological challenge is compounded with a practical challenge that for how much we have now a really vibrant and very helpful community of human rights and climate change experts, we still have very separate expertise in climate change, in human rights, and in fact, even within our human rights and climate change constituencies, we still have groups that work in relative isolation or that could work in a more strategic way together, whether it is to support the protection of children's rights, women's rights, indigenous people's rights, and others. So there's an opportunity there to bring the communities together and I think enhance mutual learning around how we can achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement in a more effective and human rights-based way. The third challenge is unfortunately a really worrisome one, the shrinking civic space and increasing attacks on climate defenders and environmental human rights defenders, which means that in fact what we're seeing is more and more difficult, if not impossible, opportunities for human rights holders and their advocates to contribute to decision-making on climate change. And that kind of really undermines the opportunity to engage with the lived experience and really making sure that the decisions we're taking on climate change, at the very least, do not repeat mistakes of the recent past, but in fact, really learn as much as possible from what has gone wrong and prevent that from happening again. The other side of the coin is that, of course, the opportunities are really immense on a very practical level. Of those legal questions that in international climate change law, and in fact in the broader international environmental law domain, remain quite undefined in relation to equity and good governance, those are all aspects that are very clearly spelled out in international human rights law and provide very clear obligations, standards, and principles to ensure transparency, participation, and consideration of the needs of the most vulnerable. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And in fact, we have so much expertise and methodologies that can be relied upon from the human rights community to make progress on climate change. But otherwise, I think that the real opportunity is that for transformation, the human rights-based approach, that genuine engagement with the lived experiences of those most affected by climate change and climate change measures is what we need to then co-develop climate solutions that can really help us make a difference in our fight against climate change and in preventing further human rights violations. And the opportunity for transformation has not yet been recognized. And I'm hoping that more and more we can provide, I think, pilot experiences to show how we can really rethink the way in which decisions on climate change are taken at every level, from the international to the local and the other way around.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's very crucial that we do not reinvent the wheel, and also I pick the mutual cooperation among states as critical. And I think Angela made reference to these, and let me ask you to respond on that issue. And when if you don't mind, could you please speak a little bit about the role of the judiciary, especially given the African context, and how how they are helping to reduce these challenges and creating opportunities with regards to human rights and climate justice.
Thank you. That question is addressed to me,
Yes,
if
yes.
I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
All right. Yes, so I think it's tried to say that the judiciary plays an important role. It really, really does. If we look at the state of climate litigation, the global south, I would say, and Africa in particular, we are lagging a bit behind. I think we have about 10 cases just in South Africa, with less than that in the rest of Africa. And we haven't really seen much at a regional level in terms of courts on the African continent. But what I do think is important, and what I can say from the South African perspective at least, is that even in the absence of really strong constitutional environmental rights, or those rights linked to climate change, judges are playing quite an activist role, and really even a governance role, if I look at some of the court cases and decisions resulting from them. So in South Africa, there was a court case on air quality, and the judge took it upon herself to link the implications of air quality to the climate crisis in the country, and reprimanded the government for continuing to approve coal-based power stations. And again, that's an example where our government has promised, in its NDC, not to approve coal-based power and to phase it out, but in practice, they're doing something completely different. The judge looked at Section 24 of our Constitution, which is the environmental right, and reinterpreted it in light of the climate crisis, saying that, in fact, that right should be immediately realizable in the context of climate change. And our government cannot say, no, we're slowly transitioning and slowly phasing things out. We need to move urgently. It's quite a contentious judgment. There are, of course, arguments that the court overstepped there, and that it wasn't that question wasn't posed to the court in that instance. But it has resulted now in the government adopting more stricter air quality regulations, and it's also resulted in other court cases where NGOs and communities have taken the South African government to court for similar actions, for hydraulic fracturing or shale gas exploration, for instance. So I think the court plays an important role, making sure that instead of, making a promise, government keeps to their promises in their NDCs, but also creating sort of that grid of accountability in terms of which we can make sure government, does what they say they're going to do. And that judgment in particular has led to a stronger policy. So I think courts are really the gatekeepers and protectors of environmental rights, facilitating climate justice. And we have another court case in South Africa. It was to do with a seismic survey. And what was interesting about that case, it wasn't directly linked to climate change, but again, the court looked at the role of indigenous communities and how they would be impacted. And the court made really interesting remarks about the fact that the cultural values towards the ocean, and whether governments understand those cultural values or not, they should play a role in government decision-making, because it would influence the community's ability to fish, for instance. It would interfere with their connection to the ocean, and climate change exacerbates that. So we have a progressive judiciary, and while in some contexts, the judiciary shouldn't overstep, I think in these instances, particularly given the severity of the climate crisis, it's judgments like that that should be welcomed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's important that the judiciary remains the gatekeepers, because as the last arbiters of these issues, these cases will almost always end up in courts, and it's important that we are aware of the challenges we face. Damilola, you want to respond to these challenges and opportunities in aligning agendas of human rights and climate action at the international level?
Thank you very much. I think I agree with the speakers, Lisa and Angela. I think they've covered very much the key points. But I think one other aspect we have to look at is also reviewing business solutions to the problem of climate change. And what do I mean? Since 2015, when we've had the Paris Agreement, what we've noticed is that while there is increased awareness, while there is even increased legislation, many of the existing contracts that we still use have not changed. And that is stifling climate action. You still see a situation whereby the petroleum contracts are being signed with the same provision, with the same language, with the same domestic obligations, domestic supply obligations. So it's business as usual. And we've seen how this is leading to a lot of disputes. We've seen a number of course, we've seen the case in Alberta, for example, in which a coal operator was challenging the new legislation by the provincial government, saying, well, the contract that we signed allows me to continue to produce coal. Why are you stopping me all of a sudden? We've seen a situation, we've seen the same case, a Dutch case with the same facts, similar facts. So the question is that why are our petroleum contracts not changing? Why are our mining contracts not changing? And we are all laying claim to advancing zero carbon or net zero. So it seems the language is not matching the reality. So there is indeed another key one that is causing a lot of troubles is that the continued use of stabilization clauses, in which you preserve the ability of a petroleum company to produce oil and gas for the next 30 years. And then that makes it very, very difficult because of the stabilization clause that has preserved that right. It makes it difficult for the state to then come forward with a climate legislation or regulation. And we've seen more than 2,000 cases both in tribunals and in courts relating to different aspects of this whole climate action, net zero plan and net zero targets that states are releasing. So I think there is an urgent need to review existing extractive contracts to make them climate aligned. If we are to really make progress rather than just rhetoric. There is also a need to reevaluate the role of investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms and how investment agreements are leading to increased claims against states, which is narrowing the regulatory space for states, making it almost impossible for states to move forward. A third aspect of how we need to align business solutions is also the issue of when we go on the field, we see many stakeholders saying, well, we are ready to transition out. We're ready to transition out and stop oil and gas production, reduce coal production, but transition out and do what? Transition out and do what? And you've seen a recent report by the International Labour Organization showing how many people will lose their livelihood, how their right to subsistence might be affected if we don't actually answer the question of what should they then do. And that is the need for entrepreneurial solutions. They need to match climate legislation with entrepreneurial solutions, entrepreneurial training, entrepreneurial funding, enhancing innovation, enhancing ability of youth to commercialize technology and innovation that will indeed, in practice, advance the low carbon energy transition. Because without this, then you will be addressing the problem of human right to clean and healthy environment while creating a violation of the right to subsistence, right to water, right to food, and right to a decent standard of living for every individual. International law should not operate in silos. There is a need for holistic solutions that otherwise we will be solving some problems while creating many more. And it's part of our mandate to ensure that we achieve that holistic solution. And that's why, we've been talking about the need for a smart mix of approaches. And of course, this might be a good time to mention that we'll be having the annual forum on business and human rights in November, the last week of November in Geneva. And the theme this year is indeed this idea of smart mix of solutions, both legislative solutions as well as practical business-oriented solutions, including technology innovation that will enhance entrepreneurship for the transition.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm still going to stay on you, Damilola, in asking about you talked about these business solutions, but considering your role as an independent expert of the UN Working Group, what role do you actually see for transnational corporations and other business enterprises in promoting climate justice? It's not only about, yes, we need to reform the ISDS processes, we need to reform the international investment law as a whole, but what for companies themselves, what role do you see for these business actors in promoting climate justice, and how can they be held accountable for their impact on human rights?
It's a great question, and it's one that I'm very passionate about, and I can speak the whole night on, but I will limit my point.
Just 4 minutes.
Because the key message we are emphasizing is that businesses should use their leverage in a positive way. Businesses can be forced for good, and they can be forced for environmental and climate injustice as well. So it's just a question of how they want to use their leverage. And we are saying they should use their leverage as as employers of labor. They should use their leverage as some businesses even have more revenue than the national budget of some countries. So for example, we've seen some positive practices coming up. We've seen some businesses saying they now have a new policy in which they will not even subcontract to any company that does not have a climate policy, or does not have an environment policy, or does not have a waste management, energy efficiency policy. That is a good way for businesses to use their leverage. Taking their entire value chain and ensuring that they integrate climate justice principles as part of their value chain. And that is the message that we are passing to businesses. A second aspect is for businesses to also be part of the solution. Climate justice is more than an academic subject in many countries, whereby we talk about these principles, but the indigenous people still do not have access to their land, to their forest. They do not have access to education. They do not have access to even health. And we say, you are a business operating in this community. What are you doing? And we're not talking about just CSR. We're talking about a new form of corporate governance that places, that goes beyond do no harm to doing good. The do no harm principle is now archaic in my view. It is now do no harm and do good. And doing good means actually investing your money to make life better, both in terms of the livelihood of people, like I've mentioned, as they transition out, making their life better, doing good in terms of providing modern technologies, environmentally sustainable technologies for those communities, doing good in terms of ensuring that whenever your business is going to lead to any sort of environmental problem or climate damage, then doing good in terms of addressing it, rather than just, so it requires a radical shift from this compliance mindset, oh, I did not violate any law, to a responsible mindset. And that's the message that we are passing across.
Thank you very much. Angela, you want to come in? I know it's a big issue in South Africa, transitioning to green economy, just transition, especially in an economy that is heavily dependent on coal, and which is significantly, yeah. So what role do you think transnational corporations can do in this, in realizing climate justice?
Thank you. Yes, I have to say, Damilola took the words out of my mouth. In my notes, I wrote that really we need a fundamental shift in how businesses operate. You know, we need to reorder the purpose of business. We need to change irresponsible business practices. We need to go beyond the do no harm approach. I think we need to build alternative models for sustainable business practices, but you know, not only putting the onus on business, saying that the legal architecture that facilitates business activities in a country needs to change as well. We cannot continue to create a legal framework that supports unsustainable business practices. And I think that that goes hand in hand with transparency and corporate disclosure, not only on the part of the business disclosing, for example, their greenhouse gas emissions or environmental impact assessments or their due diligence reports and how that's linked to human rights harms, but also disclosure on the part of government and political parties. Which corporations are funding political parties and politics in your country, and who are you voting for? So disclosure not only on the part of government, but really on the part of corporations, but on the part of government as well. And I think that that ties into, you know, earlier comments from the previous speakers about greenwashing. And then just again, to reiterate my previous comment, you know, on the just transition, yes, we should transition towards green and renewable energies, but there is evidence that a push for renewable energy can become irresponsible because the quest for critical minerals that we would need, or materials, that we will need, might displace indigenous communities. So is there, you know, an engagement and a dialogue then with indigenous communities who might lose their land for renewable projects? How can we make sure not to leave them behind? And then if we phase out fossil fuels, that should be complemented with access to affordable and renewable energy for, you know, poor people too. So I think it's a sort of a three-pronged approach. It's business, people, and government.
Oh, thank you very much. Elisa?
Yeah, I mean, just to complement, I think Damilola and Angela have done such a great job to show, I think, all the sides of this, you know, crucial question of the fair transition and the role of the business sector. Maybe just to add a couple of points. I mean, first of all, we need international cooperation for that radical reform of international investment law and the dispute settlement that goes with it. And that's where we have to keep in mind the lack of balance of powers in the area of international law, the long-standing issues that are very well known in other areas of international human rights law, in the relations with international investment law. This is not just something that states can do on their own, particularly foreign investment receiving states. And so we need to think about which international fora and which area we need international cooperation to really remove those really deep barriers to the just transition. The second point, I think, is while we have, I think, a clearer sense in terms of international human rights standards for business, that they have responsibilities to facilitate a dialogue with human rights holders in terms of that prevention of negative impacts on them, be that in preventing impacts related to climate change, but equally when, and I think those examples related to critical minerals and other just the broader renewables are really important. We can't assume that climate solutions are necessarily human rights compliant. The playing field, even in those consultations between business and human rights holders, is a really tricky one, and one that often has a long history of distrust or even harm, or where also the applicable legal regime may make things even more complicated, where, for instance, there is no recognition or sufficient recognition and protection of, say, indigenous peoples' human rights or other human rights. And what I've been thinking more and more, and I've seen some examples, is the importance of having some mediation and the role, for instance, of national human rights institutions in trying to help the dialogue, but also mediate the dialogue and ensure that adequate protection is there for human rights holders, including environmental human rights defenders. And of course, all other factors that have to do with how much business enterprises are transparent and truthful in sharing information around the risks and impacts of their own activities in relation to climate change and human rights, refraining for supporting misinformation, and of course, refraining from any lobbying or even attacks on climate and environmental human rights defenders. I think that the tense and the uneven playing field in which these relationships are happening, is one thing that in and of itself requires very careful international human rights work and both action at the national level in terms of international cooperation and support at the local level with more engagement of national human rights institutions and others to support them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I ask the last round of questions, I just want to remind participants to please use the Q&A function box to send your questions, and at the end of the webinar, we will respond to the questions. So we have this shared approach, and I think this was a theme that ran through all the presentations: mutual cooperation, handshaking across borders, collaboration. So my question to you all is that how can international organizations and regional bodies such as the UN, I mean the Working Group, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, how can these international organizations enhance their efforts to address the intersection of climate change and human rights? Do you have recommendations? What specific actions would you recommend for these organizations to step up in with regards to climate change and human rights? Anyone is free to jump in.
I'm happy to start. I think that aspect of ensuring consistent practice across the UN system in supporting a human rights-based approach to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and finance is crucial. We still see not necessarily, exactly the same practices, the same also advocacy of relevant standards. That would be the first aspect. And I think special procedures have a specific mandate to advise the UN system on how to more consistently uphold human rights in their work. That has also to do with UN coordination. And again, my second report on access to information on climate change and human rights is really, I think, inviting different UN bodies who are doing really important work on human rights and climate change to connect and ensure interoperability and accessibility of information from impacts on human health, from impacts on specific groups, and differentiated impacts and disaggregated data, really making sure that we make as much as possible available the information and the evidence base we have, and raise the awareness of public authorities and business about the foreseeable impacts of their activities and decisions in this area. Of course, the UN and many different bodies of the UN are also very engaged in the decision-making and then implementation of international climate finance. And of course, that is somewhere else where we must expect UN bodies to uphold human rights. And I think particularly when we have, when things go wrong, make sure that any lesson is learned and shared and applied to improve our systems of understanding, not really leaving the redress mechanisms as a separate entity from the decision-making and the early on planning so that those systems can improve. Other than that, I think I do believe that what the UN can be really influential is through its activities also of capacity building, education, and of course, for instance, the One Health approach, making sure that all those mechanisms for coordination and support at the national level are very much building upon the latest understanding of potential impacts on human rights and good lessons learned in terms of better protecting human rights, particularly those of situations of utmost vulnerability in the context of climate change.
Thank you very much.
Well, I will jump in and I'll frame my intervention in terms of three fights that I've been having lately. The first is some would have noticed, those of us that are active online on social media, you would have noticed the fight we had last year during the last COP in Dubai, in which there was no mention of human rights and there was no space for human rights and special procedures to actively participate. I think the tag showed that special procedures, anyway, I won't go into details, but you get the drift that if we are negotiating climate instruments, if we are talking about the COP is the place, and if human rights is not mentioned, then it shows how far we are from climate justice. It shows that stakeholders perhaps are more interested in just gathering and to discuss how they can preserve their business as usual models. If we are really serious about climate justice, human rights must be at the heart of future climate negotiations. Human rights must be part of the operations of every stakeholder talking about climate change. And if one is not interested in talking about human rights, then it's just, to me, a show. So I think that's an ongoing fight that the next COP should do better. And not only COP, even within other international organizations, OPEC, GCF, International Energy, Energy Charter Secretariat, those international organizations, IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, what are they doing to mainstream human rights into their work? Because without it, then it will be business as usual. Of course, the second fight that I've been having lately is with regional bodies, especially the African Union. Human right means a right that belongs to me because I'm human. So the idea of cherry picking human rights and saying we are going to focus on the ones that we're comfortable with and saying that there is nothing called indigenous rights in Africa, there are no indigenous people in Africa, and many other rights that the African Union has labeled as controversial. We don't recognize this in Africa. I think that misses the meaning of human rights, because human rights simply means a right that belongs to me because I'm human. And it is not the business of government to tell me which of my rights is more important or is easier for me to recognize. So I think we must be serious about human rights. We must be serious about ensuring that we recognize and protect and mainstream all human rights. Climate change is going to affect all human rights. Whether it's the right to education, right to environment, indigeneity and the likes. So we cannot pick the ones that we want to address. It is going to lead to inconsistent and an incoherent result. So it is very important to address. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Angela.
Yes, I think I fully agree with what the two speakers have said, and then maybe to address just in brief Elisa's comments, about UN organizations and other partners. There's a need for capacity building, but we often speak about, capacity building in the form of technology transfer. But I think, it can even be as simple as technical assistance for developing policies, whether it's a gender responsive policy or policies that are non-discriminatory in terms of disaster response or adaptation measures, or even just policies that are sensitive to cultural contexts in the context of climate change. And then I think what I would also like to see from organizations is, I think, or at least there's a perception that these organizations are doing a lot of work, and they are, but that they're speaking amongst themselves. So maybe to see a multi-stakeholder dialogue. So between the United Nations and civil society and business and, representatives from developing countries and vulnerable communities to either share, joint challenges, best practices, to think about how they can foster collaboration, for instance. That would be great to see. And then I think I completely agree with Damilola about the African Union. I think the African Union can play a stronger role. We have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but I don't necessarily see the African Union taking a lead in saying, all right, how do these rights link to climate change? What adaptation and mitigation, if it's, is necessary for Africa in the context of human rights? I would, for instance, like to see a special rapporteur on the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, linking human rights to climate change and reporting to the rest of the United Nations and other bodies on African-specific issues in the context of human rights and climate change. So I think there's a lot of work that can still be done, bearing in mind, you know, that of course we're grateful for the work being done. There is room for improvement.
I mean, indeed, there's quite a lot of work there that can be done. Thank you very much for your informative and insightful responses. Before I open the floor to questions, as I mentioned at the opening statement, this webinar is being co-hosted by the Human Rights Interest Group and Latin America Interest Group. So I would like to invite the co-chair of the Latin America Interest Group, Cecilia, to just make some few comments.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very, very inspiring session. And I just wanted to point out that from Latin America's perspective, we're extremely proud of being at the vanguard with the Escazú Agreement, which goes right to the center of calling for access information and participation and protection of environmental defenders. And for us, this is fundamental because trees don't have mouths. They can't speak for themselves. So we have to protect the environmental defenders. And in some of the countries that have not ratified or signed on to the Escazú Agreement, they have the highest levels of violence against environmental defenders. So for us, it's absolutely essential that attention is paid to the protection of environmental defenders to make sure that they get the justice. But many of our judiciaries in our region, unfortunately, are dysfunctional and don't necessarily provide the proper response. So we have a lot of community initiatives to provide protection to these environmental defenders. So there is a diversity of approaches to give alternative forms of justice that could be a model for other regions. So we're inspired by this. And I also happen to be in the UN as the independent expert on the right to solidarity. So I have produced reports on the shrinking civil space, and I've taken up the issue of environmental defenders being attacked in part because so much of environmental areas are deemed to be under security regimes. And so they're militarized and they are therefore unapproachable from normal democratic institutions. So we have to also pay attention to this trend of militarization and securitization of environmentally vulnerable areas. So I thank you very much for your wonderful, wonderful presentations. I feel very grateful for all the knowledge that you've given us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So we now open the floor for questions. I see quite a few questions here. I don't know how well we are doing with time, but I'll see how many questions we can answer. Some are very generic, and some I think have been asked specifically. Let me start with Chizi's question about I find the idea of conducting a human rights impact assessment on climate policies to be really interesting. I would like to ask whether there are any potential costs associated with this type of assessment which can potentially discourage national governments from conducting it. So in terms of financing costs, anyone wants to respond to this?
I can. Oh,
yes,
sorry, you
go
go ahead.
Well, I'll just make one from my understanding. One of the biggest costs that some states are worried about is the business cost, because the moment you start asking investors to conduct human right due diligence and human right impact assessment, there is the concern that you might lose their interest and they might go to another country that does not have the same requirement. So I think at the international level, there is a need, and I'm glad the independent expert on solidarity is with us. So there is a need for that common cooperative approach to ensure that this whole human right due diligence, human right impact assessment is indeed, recognized in as many countries as possible. Otherwise, a developing country that is worried about attracting investment may be afraid of that cost. You get the point.
Elisa, you wanted to say something? Or was it?
Yeah, maybe just to complement, I think at the level of human rights impact assessments or project level, that's usually a cost that's in national legislation allocated to the private developer. And of course, all the work that has been done by the working group and earlier on clarifying that would be anyway good business and part of business due diligence to carry out those assessments for their own risk management purposes. But I think that there's also the question of having higher, like the strategic assessments at the level of legislation and planning. There wouldn't be a cost necessary that could be allocated to the private sector. And that's where I think also international solidarity plays an important role and thinking more systematically about how not only climate finance, but any other international finance that may have impacts, positive or negative, on climate change and climate change solutions should include those and allocate specific funding for participatory strategic human rights impact assessments.
Yeah, thank you. Then the next question is on the Congo Basin forest. How can business companies operating in the Congo Basin forest keep the activities, logging or mining, for example, while addressing human rights in the context of the extreme vulnerability of that basin to climate change? Does anyone wants to attempt this? It's a little bit technical with regards to business, and I think there's also an issue also with the Amazon as well. Going to the areas where the indigenous peoples have not had contact with people and trying to disrupt their way of life just because of the profit maximization of this company. Sorry, Professor Olawiyi, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the world is dealing with an emergency. One of the emergencies, climate emergency. There's also biodiversity loss and all of that. So when dealing with emergencies, business as usual models will not work. That is the reality. Right. And so and that's why there is this whole emphasis on transitioning out. And this is also where international solidarity comes to play. If international organizations and even countries, developed countries, are still talking about aid at this time, we are missing the point. We should be talking about environmental funds, environmental development assistance, or rather than just aid, because it is such funds that should be used to address loss and damage, to ensure that those who would have to transition out then have new models of business, but we cannot keep saying we are logging, falling trees, and we're talking about climate change. We are talking about preventing deforestation, addressing biodiversity loss. Those are the same business models that led us to where we are. So I think the international organizations have key roles to play to reframe the language of aid and direct it towards environmental restoration.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we will not be able to address all the questions because I've just been reminded that we are out of time. Many thanks to all your questions and of course the panelists. I also want to give just 1 minute each to all the panelists. Closing remarks. Any hope for the future? Just 1 minute each.
Well, I mean, and from my side, I think that's something that we have alluded to multiple times, but maybe it's worth emphasizing this idea of like co-developing climate solutions, be that within the business sector, be then in national and local governments, but also in terms of international solidarity. We need to understand and co-develop those solutions in the light and with human rights holders with lived experiences. That's the only way in which those solutions will be meaningful and really take full responsibility and full learning from the impacts that have already been experienced, but also provide the opportunity for transformation that we need.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And if I can part with a comment, it's just that I remain optimistic. I think, yes, we've discussed today that a lot needs to be done, but a lot of good work is being done. If we look at the resolutions from the United Nations, acknowledging the right to a healthy environment, linking that to climate change, the human rights language in the Paris Agreement, the surge of climate litigation, I think the role of the advisory opinions in front of ITLOS and the International Court of Justice is going to play really a strong role in solidifying the arguments that climate change cannot be removed from human rights. Climate change is a human rights issue. And I think I'm even optimistic about the business sector. Yes, we can blame them for a lot, but a good example is when Trump, withdrew from the Paris Agreement. A lot of businesses in America stepped up and voluntarily continued to pledge in terms of the Paris Agreement. So I think, at all levels, there are actors doing good, and my hope is that this will continue.
Thank you very much. I agree with the points made by Lisa and Angela. And I think since they've covered states and businesses, I will talk about the role of other stakeholders, including ONE and the American Society of International Law. Of course, as educators, we have key roles to play in this. The idea of climate justice is a combination of climate and human rights, right? So even as we design, and of course, American Society of International Law is doing a great work by giving us this platform today to consider them together. So I think academics should follow that template as well. When we teach climate change, we should integrate human rights into it. And when we teach human rights, we should integrate knowledge on climate change to it, because teaching them separately, not bringing that multi-stakeholder approach to it, is what led us to where we are. And if we are to find solutions, academics must step up the game in this regard.
Thank you very much. And Professor Billet, any closing remarks?
Only to give 3 cheers to all participants. I think this panel was very inspiring, and I think we have a direction to go in, both as in academia, but also those of us in the audience that are working in policy making. We will heed your call.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to the American Society of International Law, just to re-echo Damilola, for giving us this platform. And I want to thank a panel of experts for sharing us your time. Professor Lisa Mugera, Professor Damilola Alawi, Professor Angela van der Berg. Thanks a lot. I also want to thank my co-chair of the Human Rights Interest Group, Mariana Hernandez, who is unavoidably absent, and our event coordinator, Melanie Gatner, who actually put all this together. Thank you very much, all our attendees and participants. Thank you. Apologies, we couldn't answer all the questions, but we hope to continue the conversations, as the experts have mentioned, in the future. Best wishes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Thanks for the invite.